you know, well, first of all, let me start with this. I like this very much. It really tells us everything about the methodology of Buddhism. If we look at the word Buddha, the etymology of this word, the etymology of the first syllable, and indeed that's the Sanskrit, but the Tibetan equivalent, Sangye, the first syllable tells us, it implies the utter eradication from our mind of all delusions, all fear, all ego, all neuroses, you know. And not only that, da implies the development to perfection in our mind of all goodness, of all virtue, wisdom, clarity, kindness, joy. So this is telling us immediately, it implies the methodology, doesn't it? It tells us the mind, and it tells us what Buddha has found to be true. This is the job he has done. And he's basically saying, if you want to achieve this job too, then here's my methodology. Follow the steps that I followed. Basically, that's it, isn't it? So that tells us already everything. It's incredible. It makes it almost too simple. You know, the Buddha's telling us that the potential, this is the Mahayana view, the potential of every living being, every mind possessor. The word in Tibetan is so delicious. I think it's much better than the term we use, sentient being. I much prefer the Tibetan. It's very blunt. Mind possessor, Semchen. We translate it as sentient being, a mind possessor. It's amazing. And of course, for the Buddha, there are trillions of them. Not just, you know, we humans are a small percentage. There are trillions of mind possessors. So what Buddha is telling us is he has done this job, and what he's found is that this is the ultimate potential. This is finally the potential of every living being. As they say in the Mahayana view, every mind, every sentient being, every mind possessor possesses naturally, just naturally, this Buddha nature. This is the natural potential of all beings. This is what Buddha's found. So, of course, this is quite a shocking view. I mean, if you go to some neuroscientist and tell me about how I get rid of all delusions and all fear and all anger and all attachment, you'll think you're mentally ill, you know. I mean, maybe in the 1930s, we tried cutting out a bit of the brain, didn't we? And it didn't work. We called it lobotomies. So clearly, it's not the view in the materialist world, and it's not the view it's not the view not only just among neuroscientists, the hard scientists, but all the soft scientists, the psychologists, the therapists. There's no way there's any view that's remotely like this. So it's a pretty abstract concept, which of course is why we stick it in the religion, you know, category. Oh yeah, that's just religion, right? No, Buddha's a psychologist. I'm sorry, his expertise is the mind. But it's interesting, we can learn about the mind. Let's discuss over these sessions. We're going to look into what the mind is, how it functions, etc., etc. But as His Holiness Dalai Lama says, you know, you can learn all this about the mind, but to actually directly experience your own mind, this is another discussion. It's quite subtle. Because so then, okay, so if it's possible that we can rid the mind of all the rubbish and grow all the goodness, it's very clear we first have to establish what the mind is. Because it's obviously not the brain, because I mean, we know very well you don't cut bits of the brain out. This is pretty clear. So we need to know what Buddha means by the mind. Well, okay, first of all, the word is used synonymously with the word consciousness, broadly speaking, in Buddhism. In different contexts, these different terms are used, but broadly they're referring to this, to the same thing. So what these words are referring to is not the brain. Very first, fundamental point, not the brain. I always quote it recently when I was working on Lama Zopa Rinpoche's book, How to Face Death Without Fear. And during that period, I was editing it, I read this book by an American medical journalist, Nick Teresi, called The Undead. It's actually it's not about zombies. It's his reporting of all the conflicts and problems and obstacles now in the medical profession, certainly at least in the States, in relation to the business of taking organs out and giving organs, you know, cutting out organs. Because, you know, there's many obstacles now, and people are not so clear anymore when death occurs. In other words, what is consciousness? This is the point, and I think it's marvelous that these problems are coming. You know, for example, we all know from centuries, in all cultures, there always have been reports of people who, quote unquote, come back to life, who look like they're dead, they're in the coffin. I've even read that in the Victorian times in England, in the UK, they put little bells in the coffin in case you woke up, you know, you'd politely ring the bell, please get me out of here. I mean, God, can you imagine, you know, when you can't be heard? But this is something that's very common. But and of course, you put it in the too hard basket in the medical profession because you can't explain it. But now it's a problem because people are coming back to life most inconveniently when you want to cut their liver out, you know. But other things as well. I mean, this fellow, he was a very wonderful man, very wonderful journalist, very funny. His expertise is death. So he had a whole chapter on you know, for example, on out of body, what people call out of body experiences while they're in their while they're having their operation. So that fits perfectly with the Buddhist view. We're going to go into this, you know, we'll discuss the Vajrayana view of the mind as well, which is most fascinating, you know, but we've got, according to that view, we've got subtle consciousness, which is what occurs after you stop breathing. And so it fits perfectly. Or, I mean, if you can be fast asleep, you can be under anesthetic, you can be, you know, or in a coma even, and you can be vividly aware of what's going on because your subtle mind, your subtle consciousness is functioning, which of course we don't posit as in neuroscience, for example. And so these experiences, you know, very interesting. So one doctor in this business was quoted in the book as saying, I can now say with certainty that consciousness is not a function of the brain. I don't know what it is, but I can say that much. Well, this is marvelous, isn't it? People are, you know, and this is where also these amazing conversations with His Holiness and the best brains in the Tibetan Buddhist world, along with the best brains in the materialist world. Last 30, 40 years, discussions, Mind and Life conferences and others as well, and most of which have been published. I mean, really, people now beginning to question their assumptions, beginning to listen to this amazing knowledge, acknowledging that there's this knowledge coming from India. As His Holiness says, it's more than 3,000 years ago. These amazing Indians, they're the ones who began the investigation into the nature of self. I mean, you know, these Indians are the ones before the Buddha who, you know, had extraordinary understanding, an incredible body of knowledge. It's only really now we arrogant modern people are even beginning to acknowledge this extraordinary knowledge, you know, which is fantastic. So mind is not physical. It's not a function of the brain, not the brain, and it's not a function of the brain. I mean, I always say, and I'm not trying to insult neuroscientists, that consciousness or mind, the brain, is the physical indicator of what's going on in the mind. And that's probably a good enough way to put it, but only at the gross level, because the Buddha's point about the mind is this. First, it's not physical. Second, it's got these much more subtle levels of cognition. And that's what these Indians more than 3,000 years ago discovered through their development of this incredible psychological skill called shamatha, called calm abiding, this single-pointed concentration, this technique that when Lord Buddha did diverge in his own direction, 500 years after that, you know, in particular in relation to his own direct experiential findings about the nature of self, you know, that he took this technique with him, and still a living, extant living technique, thoroughly practiced all right up to now. People looking like you and me up in the mountains, metaphorically or actually achieving shamatha, using this amazing technique, you know, developed by these Indians more than 3,000 years ago. So with the development of that technique, they accessed subtler levels of mind that are not posited, you know, in the materialist view, in neuroscience and psychology, which is the subject of the discussions, the more and more now with His Holiness, you know. So it's marvelous as this is happening. So clearly for the Buddha, the mind then is not, clearly, you know, the mind is not physical. It's not the brain. It's not a function of the brain. At the grosser level, in the Vajrayana model, we'll go into this later, you know, they describe gross, subtle, and very subtle consciousness. So the gross consciousness basically ceases when you stop breathing. That's the sense, the brain activity, the heart, and when the heart stops. And that's the grossest level of consciousness, is our sensory consciousness. But our mental consciousness from that model is more subtle. And then you've even got very subtle consciousness, you know, that often they say in Rinpoche describes in his book that you know, it's usually can be up to 3 days after the breathing has stopped that the mind eventually leaves the body. So anyway, the mind is not physical and not a function of the brain. The grosser level, sensory, and the grosser level of our conceptuality absolutely depends upon a decent working brain. No argument with that. Body and mind are intimately connected. Interconnected. You know, you cannot have eye consciousness. We're going to discuss this. You can't have eye consciousness, which is that part of your mind that cognizes shape and color, for example, without an eyeball. The eyeball doesn't cognize. The consciousness combined with the eyeball cognizes its objects, shape and color, for example. So then mind is not physical. Use synonymously with the word consciousness. It's got these much subtler levels of cognition. And this, if we can at least hypothesize this, then it explains why Buddha would assert reincarnation, why he asserts, you know, this capacity to develop clairvoyance. All of this is contingent upon the mind having these subtle levels of cognition. It is evident and obvious that the grosser level of mind, sensory consciousness, can't cognize a past life. You know, it's only the subtle level of our mind that we can cultivate utilizing these techniques that have come from these Indians from thousands of years. So then the other thing that's radically different and again quite shocking, and this really takes us time to think about, to process, to think about, because it's so utterly different from the materialist views of who we are and where we come from and why we're angry and why we're loving and why we're jealous and what is happiness and what is suffering. And that is that this mind of ours, this consciousness, this word mind, it refers, I say, just to spell it out, it refers to the thoughts, conceptuality, to your craziness, if you're, to your psychosis, to your bliss, to your joy, your love, your compassion, your being good at music, you're being good at football, your unconscious, subconscious, instinct, intuition, this entire spectrum of our inner being. This is mind. This is your mind, your consciousness. So, but the radical point that takes us time is that it is not the handiwork of anybody else. This is the wackiest idea for the Buddha. Okay, he doesn't talk like this. I'm being very rough, The idea that your mind can come from a creator or that your mind comes from your parents is a very weird view for the Buddha. This is just not viable. It's just not feasible. That really takes time. I mean, if you're Christian, God gives you a soul. You're a Muslim, God gives you a soul. If you're a Jew, God gives you a soul. If you're Hindu, they even though they talk about karma, they talk about this Atman, this essential self that is kind of, and this essential creator concept. Nothing like that in Buddhism. We don't need creating, basically, for the Buddha. This is where karma comes in, and we're going to discuss this because it's a function of the mind. We do find creating ourselves, basically, Buddha is saying, our own happiness and our own suffering. We are the boss. But nor does your mind, nor does your anger, your love, your kindness, your generosity, your forgiveness, your psychosis, your being good at football or music, nor do they come from your parents. This is a crystal clear point for the Buddha. It's shocking for us because we're so utterly familiar and convinced of the view that, I got my music from my mother. I got my anger from my mother. I got my psychosis from my mother. But not for the Buddha. You got your genes from your mother. Yep. You got your genes, your brain. Absolutely no contradiction. But that ain't your mind, baby. They're the indicators. You got those genes, yes. But that's not your mind. We're going to go into this. So just starting with that point, that's the hypothesis. That's the point, and we try to unpack it. So then this is a key point for the Buddha. This discussion about what the mind is and where and how it's not the handiwork of another person, a creator or your mummy or daddy, or not physical. This is fundamental in Buddhism. If we can prove that Buddha's wrong, and Buddha please go ahead, they have to not just believe him. As His Holiness says, if you can prove Buddha's wrong at some point in your practice, then you must reject him. Of course you must. Don't just believe him. So if we were to prove Buddha wrong, then of course, the whole of Buddhism would collapse into a heap of absurdity. It wouldn't stand up. As it is, it's a utterly coherent worldview, utterly coherent view of the universe, of what happiness and suffering, all the realms of existence, where do beings come from, who are we, blah, 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 all these answers. This is part of Buddha's worldview that's utterly linked, utterly contingent upon this concept of consciousness. And indeed, the concept of karma, the law of cause and effect, that plays out in consciousness. These are fundamental, absolutely fundamental for the coherence of Buddhism, So of course, most of us might not want to study the big worldview. We just maybe want to watch our breath or something. Nothing wrong. You can be a 1% Buddhist. Okay, so mind is not physical. Mind has got much subtler levels. Your mind is not a function of the brain. It depends upon the brain at a gross level. Your mind doesn't come from mummy and daddy. Your thoughts and feelings and emotions don't come from mummy and daddy, nor from a creator, which is very shocking for people who have great faith in a creator. That's like worse than a communist, It's the worst shocking view. And mind goes to these much more subtle levels. And finally, of course, indicated by that word Buddha, mind has this marvelous potential. Every living being has this marvelous potential. If we could even begin to understand this, even intellectually, it would give us great courage, great perseverance to continue to practice. Because as Lama Zopa says, we can mold this mind into any shape we like. How amazing, So of course, Buddha doesn't posit another part of us called a soul or a spirit. The Greeks call it an essence. The Muslims call it a soul. I think the Jews and the Christians call it a soul. The Hindus call it an Atman, a self. There's something intrinsic that's independent, intrinsic, either coming from God or is this kind of essential nature that we have. Nothing like that. And that's where the teachings on emptiness, of course, Buddha's main teachings. And that's where he diverged from the Hindus, mainly in relation to his own experiential findings about not just the nature of self, but the nature of the universe, which brings us to his teachings about emptiness. Okay, so in the monastic university system in Tibet, as we know, and indeed they study the text, they study the mind in great depth. So one of the texts that we study in our centers, and maybe you people have studied it, I don't know, is called Low Rig. Mind and awareness is usually translated. Low Rig, two different words for mind, really. And so there's two sections to that text, and we're just going to use that as a basis, rough basis of our discussion. I'm going to talk about karma as well, which of course doesn't come in this text, but I think it's totally related because it's a function of the mind. What the mind does is create karma, So in this text, we learn that there's the epistemological model of the mind and the psychological model. And we'll discuss mainly the psychological, but it's crucial to at least understand the bare minimum about the way mind functions, which is the epistemological model. And this is beyond fascinating. I mean, it's extremely complex and, but utterly fascinating, the way mind functions. We're going to go into the psychological model, mostly the contents of our mind, the contents of our mental consciousness. But this is already an excellent starting point. And it already tells us it tells us hugely about the way we misuse our mind, misunderstand its function, and end up leading ourselves up garden paths, because we misinterpret, certainly from the Buddhist perspective. So from the epistemological model, the mind functions. There's different ways of presenting, but I like to put it this way. The mind, we have sensory consciousness and we have mental consciousness. So the difference between these is unbelievable, but we don't discuss like this, not in modern psychology, I don't think, or certainly maybe in neuroscience. I'm not sure. I haven't studied them. But this is really hugely important to understand. It's quite sobering, actually. And when we understand how we confuse these two, we see how we give so much power to our body. We make the body the boss, as Lama Yeshe puts. In other words, we make our sensory consciousness the boss. We give so much power to our sensory consciousness that it simply doesn't have. And it leads us up garden paths for sure. So, okay, I always use a simple one example. If I say to you, this is my same thermos. I've got my same thermos. I haven't lost it or broken it yet. It's my one. I always use my example. I say to you, this is a nicely designed, really nicely designed thermos. I chose it. I went online. Usually these thermoses are so ugly, in my opinion. So I chose this one. It's for elegant and sits nicely together, small, and it's a thermos and it keeps my hot water hot. Okay, so I'll tell you. So if you'll see me with my eyes, I'll look here and I will announce what a really well-designed thermos. So obviously, without any confusion, without any doubt, we would say my eyes are seeing a well-designed thermos. If I'm in love with Fred or somebody, absolutely the same, isn't it? I will say, oh, my Fred is so divine, I can't stop looking at him. So we are assuming my eyes see handsome Fred. Well, Buddha's saying, don't be ridiculous, Your eyes don't have that capacity. Of course, we can talk about it in a general sense, but to be very specific, the function of your sensory consciousnesses is incredibly limited. Eye consciousness, conscious or mind, remember, not physical. So that part of your mind that functions through the medium of the eyeball and all the bits and pieces working nicely, it has the capacity to cognize merely two things, shape and color. It's really limited. Shape and color, that's it. I always use the example of, when I hear that one trumpet sound, a trumpet note, I'll bliss out. Wow, that's blissful Miles Davis, I'll say. But ear consciousness can only hear mere sound, taste mere, sweet, sour, whatever. Very, very limited. But look at the power we give our bodies, our sensory consciousness. As far as we're concerned, we are only the body. I mean, we don't even posit a separate part of ourselves. We are only the body. And our physical experiences run our lives. You know, the smallest pain in your knee and you're totally depressed. The slightest pretty sound out there, Miles Davis, my mind is happy. We don't question any of this. We don't analyze it. We don't go into more depth. As a neuroscientist, we've got our own style, no doubt, and I don't know it. But this is the Buddhist approach. And when we realize that the eye consciousness can't see a handsome Fred, it's a joke. So what's happening? You've got to ask the question, which part of my mind is cognizing, wow, Fred is so divine? Well, that's your mental consciousness, folks. And as Lama Zopa says, that's where the workshop is. Tibetans point here, you know, to the heart when they talk about the mind, mental consciousness. So sensory consciousness is this very limited, but unbelievably powerful. It's like the doorway between us and the universe, isn't it? Sensory consciousness is very limited, but we give it so much power. So the eyes cannot see a beautiful thermos. There's not a possibility. So what happens is this, and this is not kidding, quicker than Google, my mental consciousness is accessed. The millisecond my eyes land on this shape and color, because one of the ways they talk about the mind, we'll discuss this, this is very powerful. As Geshe Tashi in London said, one function of the mind is, the mental consciousness, is that whatever we have ever seen, heard, tasted, touched, smelt, thought about, ever, since beginning of this time, remember, for the Buddha, we didn't discuss that. That's a major point where we'll go into that later. Then everything is stored in our mind as memories, as bare bone memories. You know, everything is stored. As he said, it's like you're watching a movie. You're shooting a movie all day, he said. Everything is stored in the mind. So the second my eyes see that shape and color, then quicker than Google, I'm not kidding, my mental consciousness is accessed. And up comes this story. And what is it? What's in your mental consciousness? This is the point now, how that functions. Is at the grossest level only. We live at the grossest level of our mental consciousness, which is thoughts, concepts. Okay, from the epistemological point of view, one way to describe is you've got sensory and you have mental. Then another way to describe is the way mind functions is you've got, which is the function of the mental consciousness, you've got the grosser level, which is the level we function at, which is what we're going to talk to when we talk about in the psychological model, which is actually conceptual. Or the level we function in day-to-day life, including intellectual concepts about mathematics, about music, all the clever parts of our brain, you know, the clever parts of our mind when we learn intellectual concepts, but also our emotions and feelings. And this is the shocking part. All of this is rooted in conceptual thought. So anger is a conceptual thought. Attachment is a conceptual thought. And this is what we're going to spend time looking at. So all stored in my mind, all these memories, and out of my mouth in 1 millisecond will come an opinion, an opinion based on my taste, based on what are my tendencies in this life, and certainly many of the ways we respond are going to be based upon tendencies we brought with us from previous lives. We'll go into this. There are a series of opinions. What a nicely designed thermos, how divine Fred is. Their opinions, viewpoints, conceptual stories, viewpoints. And this is where the workshop is. This is what we have to learn to understand. This is where the power of the mind is. So a handsome Fred is a conceptual story made by my mind. My eye consciousness can see merely shape and color. That's it. So the power of the mind is in the mental consciousness, but we empower the senses. I mean, the senses have because we experience feelings, and we're going to go into this one. This is hugely important to understand the word feeling in Buddhism. So that already the difference then between sensory and mental. Now look how we are in our daily lives, you know. We go around, and the second a pleasing experience for one of our senses arises, then immediately happiness will come, an unpleasant one, suffering will come, and we don't have any control over it. We assume, you know, because we assume the ugly sound out there is the cause of why I'm miserable, the handsome Fred is the cause of why I'm happy. There's so much to unpack here. And even with the bit that we'll do in these 4 weeks, unpacking a little bit of this and looking at the function of these different parts of our mind, it's a revelation. It gives us the tools to do the job of being our own therapist, as Lama Yeshe puts it, which is what being a Buddhist is. Being a Buddhist, you begin to be a Buddhist when you start to work on your mind. So if you don't have any means to work on your mind, if you don't know what your mind is and don't know what it means work on your mind, which means you can't distinguish between sensory and mental, and you can't distinguish between attachment and love, then how can you work on your mind? It's useless. You can't just close your eyes and cross your fingers and watch your breath, hoping something magical will happen. You need facts and numbers and figures, you know. That's like every body of knowledge. But we go, oh, it's just the mind, you know, watch my feelings, feel my body. It's just too gross. It's too superficial. We need to understand the workings of the mind. And this is utterly different from the workings that are described in neuroscience. We're not discussing the physical at all. We're not discussing the physical. We don't need to get a microscope to look at our brain, to look into our minds. You ask these great yogis way back, 3,000 years ago, who'd accomplished shamatha, who've seen the past and the future, and have got absolutely radiant, blissful minds because they've conquered so much of their delusions. You ask them where their brain is, they wouldn't have a clue. Because the mind for the Buddha is totally internal. It's not physical. There's no physical aspect whatsoever. So learning to know it is a pretty intense job. And this is the job of being a Buddhist. This is the job, you know. Okay. So, summarize so far. 1, mind is not physical. It is not a function of the brain. It's intimately, at the grosser level, intimately connected to the brain. No argument. And the brain could be said to be, as I said, without insulting neuroscientists, a physical indicator of what's happening in the mind. Nothing wrong with saying that. The genes, you could argue with the same thing. That could be a way of describing genes and chemicals and DNA and all this business, you know. This is a way these are physical indicators of the karma of the person. You could argue that way. We'll discuss. So mind is not physical. Mind is not the handiwork of a creator, nor is it the handiwork of your mummy and daddy. It goes to much more subtle levels. It's got this amazing potential to be perfected completely and rid of all the delusions, what Buddha has found to be possible. And the other point, of course, if we're not created by mummy and daddy, and if we're not created by a creator, and if in other words, we don't start, and we certainly do not start in the mother's womb, which is the usual view. You begin in your mother's womb and God puts a soul there. You begin in your mother's womb when the egg and sperm come together, depending on your view. And that's the beginning of Robina. So there's no continuity of Robina beforehand, is there? You track yourself back to God, or you track yourself back to mummy, daddy, grandpa, and the monkeys. They're the two systems, aren't they? Not for the Buddha. You track yourself back to previous moments of your own mind. So, you know, if you track it, one of the terms they use in Buddhist psychology is your mind is like a mental, they use the term mental continuum. So this moment of consciousness, this moment of cognition, the job of your mind is to cognize. This is a crucial thing. We're going to get into this. To cognize. So this moment of cognition, the main cause of it is the previous moment of cognition. And the main cause of that moment is the previous moment of cognition. And the main cause of that is the previous moment of cognition. So your mind is this unbroken chain of mental moments, if you like, this mental continuum, this moment from the previous, from the previous, from the previous. And if you keep going back and back and back, you'll get back inexorably. You get back to the first second of conception if you keep going back like that. So then the question has to be, well, where does that first moment when it joined the egg and sperm, where does that first moment of consciousness come from? A previous moment of that consciousness. The egg went back to mummy's body, the sperm, you track it back to daddy's body, or you track yourself back to God if you talk about a soul, but not for the Buddha. You track your own consciousness back to a previous moment of itself. So this is the fundamental concept of karma. So karma is the law that for Buddha he has recognized as a natural law that runs the universe and that plays out in the minds and lives of sentient beings. You can't separate mind from karma and karma from mind. They're fundamental. They're studied in different texts, and you can study mind without talking about karma, equally karma without talking about mind. We're going to bring them together. Mind, the word intention, in fact, we're going to go into the different components of the mind. The word intention is the real meaning of the word karma, it seems. Volition, not intention meaning like good motivation, but bare bones, I will, volition. That's the meaning of karma. That's, the beginning of anything is the intention, I will. That's the beginning of the process of creating karma, quote unquote. We'll go into this. Okay, so your sensory consciousness is this bare bones, capacity to function that experience shape and color, sound, taste, touch, whatever you want, very limited. But we give them this power, don't we? We give them more power than they have. So that's why it leads us up garden paths. We get so utterly confused, So then, okay, so that's the key point I wanted to make. As far as the epistemological model is concerned, in relation to there being sensory and mental. Now let's look at the mental. Okay, now another way of describing, and this is where in the way of describing the way the mind functions, is we've got in the mental consciousness, we have the grosser level of cognition, which is conceptuality, which is the tip of the iceberg of how the mind functions. But this is basically all we posit. I mean, I think in modern psychology and neuroscience, there's I don't think, no real meeting points about what dream mind is, what the coma mind is, what all these strange experiences that people have, like out-of-body experiences. You know, I mean, this particular doctor, this book I told you about, The Undead, you know, of course, the usual medicos are kind of cynical about people who report they watched the doctor do this, certainly floated above your body while you're under anesthetic, and they don't trust, you know, no, so it's not possible. Of course, from the medical profession point of view, it isn't possible because you're under anesthetic. But he joked about this one particular woman who had to have such a radical procedure that from the medical point of view, she had to none of her organs could work. So from their perspective, there was no way there could be a possibility of any awareness whatsoever. But he joked and said she reported the most vivid so-called out-of-body experience. You technically don't, from the Buddhist perspective, you don't leave your body actually, but the experience of the subtle mind is that you're out of your body, but you're not actually, you're still in your body. So that's another, that we'll go into that. But I mean, so why did I tell you that story? I forgot the reason. Oh yeah, mental consciousness. We have conceptuality. And then the subtler level, and we never access that. They simply call it perception. It's a non-conceptual capacity of cognition that they call perception in Buddhist psychology. Clearly that word is used a very specific way here, not the way we tend to use it in ordinary daily life. And then that is a level of consciousness that you can only get in a subtle level once you've got single point of concentration. And that's direct, they call that direct cognition. It's pretty abstract for us because we only know conceptuality, which includes all our emotions, you know, which is a shock to us, we're going to go into this. So the mental consciousness is what we're going to talk about, okay? The mental consciousness. That's where the workshop is, as Lama Zopa says. This is we're going to the psychological model. We won't go much into the detail at all of the epistemological model, which is extremely fascinating, but we won't do that here. We'll just mainly go into the mental consciousness and how, and the contents of our mental consciousness. So the Buddha, they talk about how the Buddha talks about we've got 84,000 neurotic states of mind. And I keep asking the Geshis and different people, where can I find this map of the mind? They never can tell you where it's there, but they always talk about how Buddha talks about 84,000 ridiculous delusions, ridiculous afflictions, misconceptions in the mental consciousness. But so, okay, in the model of the mind in Buddhism, they categorize all the thousands upon thousands upon thousands of thoughts and feelings and emotions, the way we use the words, into simply three categories. This is very kind of already very shocking and marvelous because it's so easy to understand it. But it's absolutely not how we think in psychiatry or in psychology. I mean, look at the volumes, for example, of thousands of mental illnesses. And every day we're discovering new variations of new variations of new variations. But for the Buddha, there are three categories of states of mind in the mental consciousness. There's no fourth. This is very shocking, but very marvelous that we can use it. There are those that are deluded, misconceptions. The classic word they use in Buddhist psychology, as we know, is afflictions. They're all the neurotic, deluded, ridiculous ones. Lama Yeshe, he's so amazing. Lama Yeshe, I think when I edited his book Mahamudra, and we're going to discuss this because it's very much about the mind, about understanding the emptiness of the mind, the ultimate nature of our mind. In Lama's book, I remember in the preface that I wrote it, I identified Lama, at least 21 different terms Lama came up with. And I'm sure there's more. He was so intent upon describing to us Western people, mostly Western people back then anyway, it's now everywhere, all over the world, just the way these deluded states of mind function. Because this is not a category we use in modern psychology. You don't talk about negative and positive states of mind. That sounds too moralistic. We don't like that. You know, it sounds like judgment. But this is exactly the way Buddhism talks. So we've got the first lot, neurotic, deluded, ridiculous. They're all totally I-based and fear-based. In their nature, they are fear-based. They're horrible. They're disturbing emotions, delusions, these different terms. I'm going to go into them. Then you've got the positive qualities. So what are the first lot? Some of the examples. Well, you've got the 3 poisons. The 3 poisons, there's 84,000 all subsumed to 3, which is most convenient. And these 3 poisons, the 3 toxic emotions, as we know, ego grasping, it's known colloquial ignorance is called, which is the root delusion, and known colloquially as ego grasping when it clings to the self, the misconception of a self. That's the root of the problem, such that when it is uprooted, you've realized emptiness and you're now getting out of samsara, So the root one, the most primordial, hardest to see, that's there, deep in our bones. And now on the main voice of that root delusion is this one that's so well known in Buddhism called attachment. And then on the basis of that, we then have the third one, which is basically aversion. So to understand these 3, on the face of it, they sound really simplistic, like I say, you don't go to your therapist, oh, I got a bit attached today. Had a bit of aversion. He should laugh at you, go home and what, you want to kill your husband, because we tend only go to therapy when we're having a mental breakdown, So we need to learn, these 3 states of mind. If we can learn to understand these, even intellectually first, this gives us the job. This tells us the job of being a Buddhist. We'll have a deep understanding of ourselves and indeed then of other people. This is not joking. To understand ignorance, attachment, and aversion. I mean, in psychological terms, modern psychological terms, neuroscientific terms, psychiatric terms, it sounds like a joke, like so stupid, so cute, so simple, but it's profound. As Lama Yeshe said, I could tell you about attachment for 1 whole year. You'll never begin to understand it until you start doing the work inside, because we're not talking with microscope on our own brain. We're talking about developing a microscope to look into the internals, to become our own therapist, as Lama Yeshe puts it. It's so accurate, but it just takes time. It's a job you can't force. So the 3 poisons are fundamental. And then there are all these branch delusions. I mean, this text, when we learn it, if you study Lorig, in the psychological model, you learn there's a list of 51 different states of mind. There are actually thousands, but they point out these 51. So the first category are the negative, deluded, neurotic, afflicted, unhappy, disturbed states of mind, attachment, anger, jealousy, low self-esteem, depression. We know them intimately. Then you got the second lot, which is the virtuous, positive, reasonable, appropriate, valid states of mind, if you like. Love, kindness, compassion, forgiveness, these things. Then you have the third category. They call them neutral, usually negative, positive, neutral. And that's a really, we sort of, that misleads us. We think that means they're not important. Absolutely not. So that's why I'd rather call this third category the mechanics of the mind. They're the mechanics of your mind. So whether you're a murderer or a meditator, you need good concentration. So concentration, this is where we have to become familiar with this view in Buddhism about this idea of non-virtuous or negative. Don't hear it in a moralistic way. It's a particular characteristic of certain states of mind. And they are the ones that cause suffering. That's it. So the second lot, the virtuous ones or the positive ones, when we can understand these characteristics, then it will tell us about the third characteristic, the third category, which is that these states of mind are neither negative nor positive. Concentration is neither negative nor positive, but it's crucial. It doesn't mean it's not important. It's crucial. Whether you're a murderer, like I said, a murderer or a meditator, you need concentration. You need good memory. The word mindfulness, for example, that we know a lot in the West, we've got all these bells and whistles on it. But actually, it's in this third category, and it's simply the capacity to not forget what you're doing moment by moment. Well, as Lama's Open nicely puts it, thieves need mindfulness. But we so put it into we make it sound very holy. We've got all these bells and whistles on it, but that's not the meaning of it at all. It's neither negative nor positive. Thieves need mindfulness. So this is crucial to understand the meaning of what it means. The meaning of virtuous and non-virtuous is absolutely fundamental to understanding Buddhist psychology. Absolutely fundamental. Therefore, fundamental to understanding your practice, and therefore fundamental to understanding how you can become a Buddha. Because Buddha's simple point is this: what he's found, which is indicated by the etymology of the word Buddha, is that the delusions, the afflictions, the neuroses, the disturbing emotions. What he's found is that they are what they say is that they're adventitious. They're not intrinsic. They're not integral to who we are. And therefore, they can be removed. This is what Buddha has found. Now, this is a very shocking point from the psychological point of view in modern world and in neuroscience. I mean, this is a bizarre idea that you can utterly get rid of all anger, all attachment, all jealousy. It sounds, we would say that you're mentally ill if you didn't have those, you know, because we so posit, don't we, our view of a normal person in our world, in the modern philosophical materialist world, the view of a normal person, we give equal status to all these kinds of states of mind. We would say a normal person has some anger, some attachment, some jealousy, you know, some love, some intelligence. I mean, there's no view that you can get rid of all this stuff. So it just sounds so peculiar to us. I mean, initially, it's a shocking concept. We can't even imagine what a person would be like if they didn't have delusions. This is why it's my own comment here, but look at His Holiness over the years, you know. I mean, of course, all the Tibetans utterly accept that he's a Buddha. They totally accept, they've got complete 100% confidence that he is a Buddha, which means he's rid of all attachment, all ego, all fears, all jealousy, which means he doesn't need a human body, which means he's chosen consciously to be reborn as this Tibetan man to be a benefit to sentient beings. They understand that. So they see him as the Buddha, as perfect. So you can see with His Holiness over the years, you know, I've noticed that he talk more and more when he's talking to modern people, he tries to talk like an ordinary person, like I've got anger, I've got this. For example, you know, Tibetans, when they teach, would never describe their own experiences. They always talk about the yogi this and the yogi that. They would never describe their own experiences. And we all know they always talk about how, oh, I know nothing. I know nothing. Well, it backfired. Lama Zopa quoted this in one of his, in the death book, actually. It was wonderful. Back in Wisconsin years ago, at a teaching by His Holiness, one man burst into tears and said, well, you know, Your Holiness, if you don't know anything, what hope do we have? Which is a really good point, you know. And so His Holiness kind of backtracked a bit and he said, well, he did know a few things, he said. But I've noticed now, because I don't know if anybody else has had this observation, but when he gives teachings now in public teachings with Western people, he talks like an ordinary person. He talks like we don't trust if a person doesn't talk about their own experience. So he talks about when I was 15, I think I understood a bit about emptiness then. And then I understood this when I was, he talks that way now because that's how it makes sense to us, you know. And it was so sweet. Rinpoche mentions this in his book, that at that time in Wisconsin, His Holiness also mentioned to everybody that when he first went to India in 1956, it was the 2500th anniversary of the Buddha's enlightenment or something, he said he had a memory. It was so humble. He said, he had a memory of being at a teaching of the Buddha at the very back of the crowd, he said. I had a memory of it. So that was, I thought it was very moving to hear that, you know. So he did say, he showed he did know something after all, you know. Anyway, I don't know why I got it. Yeah, His Holiness, but why I mentioned that. Yeah, because we can't imagine a person who has no anger. So he always jokes about how he got anger, you know, because we just think it's weird if you don't have anger. But on the other hand, if you look at His Holiness, for 70 years, he has not stopped. You think about it. For 70 years, since he's 15 years old, when he was given the job of running Tibet, he hasn't stopped. He has not stopped trying to fix Tibet, you know. But you can see he's funny, he cracks jokes, he doesn't seem to get depressed, he tries to tell us he gets angry, but we can tell he doesn't. He's a happy fellow. For 70 years he hasn't stopped in this traumatic environment. Can you imagine? We'd all be having mental breakdowns. He's like the daddy of that entire country, but he hasn't stopped socially, politically, diplomatically, in every possible means to try and get the situation in Tibet to change. But he never gives up. He's always happy fellow, you know. So, I mean, even on the face of it, you have to see he's kind of not ordinary. But he would be there's the evidence, you know, the evidence. I'm sure if they looked at his brain, the evidence that you can get rid of attachment, get rid of anger, and guess what? Get rid of suffering as a result, because they're the cause of suffering. This is Buddha's fundamental analysis. It's so simple. Buddha's analysis is actually so simple, but because it's utterly the opposite of what we think, we can't hear it. Literally, we can't hear it. It seems almost simplistic to us, you know. No, it can't be like that. We can't believe it, you know. So You've got your negative, neurotic, deluded, off the wall, ridiculous, fear-based, deeply disturbing states of mind, which we consider normal. How depressing can you get? Then you've got the virtuous, real, they're our saving grace, you know. They're our saving grace. Love, compassion, intelligence, kindness, generosity, forgiveness. My goodness. These are the source of happiness for the Buddha. And these are valid states of mind. The deluded ones are not valid. And we're going to go into what that means, valid state of mind. Now, the third lot, we need them. And they are really developed hugely in concentration meditation. You really hugely develop your mindfulness, your concentrate, all these things. And then and they are the tools with which we can live a decent life, you know. The mechanics of our mind. What time is it? 10 to what? 7. You're the same time as me, aren't you? I'm in your mountain time, aren't you? Oh yeah, me too.
Yes.
So that means it's 10 to 8. We start at 7. Okay. So I've done a little bit of an overview so far. We're now going to, over these 4 weeks, going to unpack these concepts. Okay. But are there any questions right at this moment about what I've discussed so far? If not, that's perfectly fine. Nothing in the notes down there, Christian, in the chat.
Nope, nothing in the chat.
Okay. Anybody has any questions, and you're very welcome to ask me right now. About the use of words, about definitions, what you'd like, whatever you'd like. If not, it's fine. Okay, I'll keep going then. Excuse me, just a second. What happened to my tissue? I'm sorry, I can't continue without a tissue. I have to leave you for a second so you can look at Buddha for a minute. Okay. Okay, so let's go into then. Let's understand the 3 poisons. I think it's a good start. And I mean, if you've heard me talk before, that's all I ever talk about. I kind of feel like a fraud sometimes. All I do is talk about the same things. But we have to, you know, we have to, because every time I talk about it, I get a slightly deeper understanding. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity. I remember it was recently, I've never heard this before, and many people tell me they hadn't heard it before, but the young Ling Rinpoche, the reincarnation of His Holiness's root guru, Ling Rinpoche, who's been, I don't know if he's been to Denver, but he's traveled, he's been in America, and he's been in Australia and other countries. I've seen him in England and other countries, but he often says that, you know, these 84,000 that Buddha talks about, these 84,000 afflictions, 84,000 neurotic states of mind, 21,000 are rooted in ignorance, the first of the 3 poisons. The second, another 21,000 are rooted in attachment. The third 21,000 are rooted in aversion. And the fourth 21,000 are rooted in all 3. So it seems like this whole kind of coherent internal map of the mind, which is so fascinating. It's so utterly fascinating. So on the face of it, when we hear about, you know, the 2 main ones effectively in daily life, ego grasping is the root one. That's the colloquial term for this root ignorance that believes in an intrinsic, separate, definite, solid, set in stone me. That's the root of the problems. But that's not dealt with until we get to the advanced stages where we can start to realize, understand emptiness. So so here we're going to discuss attachment and aversion. Okay. They're both, so attachment effectively, from the Four Noble Truths point of view, effectively, Buddha says attachment is the main source, as Lama Zopa says, the main source of suffering in this daily life, because it's the cause of continuing, because we've got the sensory body, which is driven by attachment in the mental consciousness, and we'll describe this, then that perpetuates rebirth. This is the most powerful drive in us, this attachment. And it's such a simple word. And the trouble is, too, we define it differently in our own terms. You know, we have to look at Buddha's definition. We all know that one word can have different definitions, but we just conflate our meaning with Buddha's, and that's a complete mistake. You'll get very confused if you do that. As Lama Zopa says, when we hear that Buddha says you've got to give up attachment in order to get happy, we get confused. We go, oh, as Rinpoche says, you mean I've got to give up my happiness? I've got to give up my heart? Because we have a different conception, a different definition of attachment. So the thing that's hardest for us, because we don't have it in our culture and in our psychological model, We have it in the Christian teachings. We call it, we have virtuous and non-virtuous. That's very common, but it's religious. And it's very hard for us to hear it as a psychological thing. We just hear it as religion, And when we hear it as religion, then of course, if we're Christian or Muslim or Jew, it's God says you shouldn't do this. And so then we hear it in terms of blame, guilt, bad, good, all that kind of thing. We can't hear it psychologically. So it's important to hear it properly. So we have to get used to that. Because Buddha's main point is that these states of mind are the cause of our suffering. He's not trying to be mean to us. He's trying to make us have compassion for ourselves. Honey child, if you don't want to suffer, you better start giving up these states of mind. He doesn't say you're a naughty person, I'll send you to hell if you don't. I mean, although you can hear that, Tibetans are very fundamentalist the way they talk, I think. If you hear Lama Zopa, it sounds like hellfire and brimstone, doesn't it? So we've got to hear it really properly, So this first state, the first category of states of mind, well, I would say the first, but you could say the second, doesn't matter. The negative ones, the neurotic ones, the non-virtuous ones. There's a much more detailed description of these, and sometimes they're not always negative, or if they're non-virtuous, they're not always negative, and vice versa. But never mind that. Just generally speaking, here now we're describing these as the rubbish ones, the ones that cause us pain and therefore cause us to harm others. That's the evolution. So the deluded ones then, what are their characteristics? What are the characteristics of them? Well, first intellectually we have to understand it. And this is, first of all, they're called disturbing emotions. And this is the first one we should really start to focus on. And that ought to be enough for us to want to get rid of them. So anger is a disturbing emotion. Jealousy is a disturbing emotion. Anger is a disturbing emotion. Attachment is a disturbing emotion. But we might agree with it, but this is where the problem comes. This is where we're going to bring in karma from time to time. We know they're disturbing. We know they're deeply disturbing. We know we are out of our brain with disturbance. But our problem is in our approach to these states of mind, because we have a huge misconception of their cause, then we don't think we need to work on the anger itself. This is where the karmic one comes in. The view that's fundamental to the world, and you don't have to, your Jewish mummy or Catholic mummy didn't teach you this. You get born with this, is this absolutely primordial belief that the world out there, the objects of the five senses, that's where suffering is, and that's where happiness is. So if I'm angry, why are you angry, Robina? Well, Fred was mean to me. No one's going to question that. How dare he be mean to you? That is wrong. So then naturally, I know I'm disturbed. The anger is disturbing, but I think I'm allowed to be angry. Look what Fred did to me. This is the most massive stumbling block for even our wanting to look into our mind. Why should I change? Fred is the problem. This is the major misconception that is why it is so hard to want to look into our minds. I mean, we've been studying Buddhism for 20, 30, 40 years. You're going to go to a Buddhist center and they're all going to be fighting with each other, totally believing the other person is to blame, even though intellectually we know the Buddha's view is different. So it's really hard because this is deep. This is the samsaric view. It's a samsaric view. We're all samsarists. That's our philosophy, which is that I'm an innocent victim. I didn't ask to get born. Someone else made me. Someone else plonked me on this planet, and bad things happen to me unfairly, and good things happen unfairly as well, but I don't care. Give me more. That's how we live our lives. So we're like these innocent victims who don't feel, as Lama Zopa said, this is pretty shocking, actually. Rinpoche said, the vast majority of all humans on the planet have absolutely no idea that what goes on in their mind plays any role at all in their lives. Now, that's hard to comprehend, but think about it. All that means is, yes, I know I'm angry, but excuse me, Fred caused it. So my mind isn't playing a role at all. Fred is the cause of my suffering. And so much do we believe that not only is Fred the cause of my suffering, but when you ask me about my suffering, and I remember it years later, I will describe Fred. So not only do I think he's the cause of my suffering, I even think he is the suffering, because our memory holds all those pictures. So in other words, we are so disconnected from what goes on in our mind, and crucially, and that what goes on in our mind is the most important thing. This is Buddha's point. I mean, it sounds easy words, but my goodness, have a look at us. It's unbelievably difficult to do it. Unbelievably difficult, you know. It's quite advanced, actually. So what we can do is understand it first and try, you know. So Buddha is telling us, okay, let's look at the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths is Lord Buddha's first teaching. You know, he got enlightened in Bodh Gaya, and he walked, and takes about 8 hours to drive. So it probably takes you about a few days to walk there. He walked to Varanasi, and he went to Deer Park, which is in, out of Varanasi, a few miles to Sarnath, which is now Sarnath, and that's where Deer Park is. This marvelous place, you know. He gave his first teaching there, and it was these four truths for the noble ones, and of course the framework of these four is suffering. So the first one is there is suffering. The second is there are causes. The third is you can get rid of suffering and its causes, and fourth, how to do it. Very practical. So the point is, in the second noble truth, where Buddha describes very clearly, there are two main causes of suffering. It's so straightforward. It's so simple, but we can't hear it because it's like, we just can't hear it because we make it so complicated. There are hundreds of causes. Okay, this is karma, the law of cause and effect. We all know just to produce one small thing, you need many, many causes to come together, don't you? Even a rose. So many things have to come together just to get one rose. Well, can you imagine so many things equally have to come together just to get one moment of suffering, one moment of happiness? These Four Noble Truths refer to the happiness as well. Just flip them over, you know. So there are, as far as Buddha is concerned, there are hundreds of causes that have to come together. External causes, secondary causes, substantial causes, these causes, those causes. But he narrows it down to two main causes, such that if you change those, you cut the root of suffering, which is the point. So the two main causes of our suffering, Buddha says, suffering in general, a specific moment of suffering, a suffering realm, whatever you want to call it, there are two main causes. The first one is the past action. So let's say it's Fred, a moment of suffering with Fred. Well, that moment, each moment is a moment, each moment things are happening. So that moment of suffering. So then the main cause of that, and this is the part that's impossibly hard for us to hear, the main cause of that moment of my suffering in relation to Fred saying bad words to me is that my past action of doing something similar to that to Fred 2.5 lives ago, whatever you like. Because karma is a natural law as far as Buddha is concerned. He didn't make it up. It's not random. It's not punishment. It's not reward. There's no punisher. There's no rewarder in Buddhism. There's no creator. We all do it to ourselves. It's not moralistic. It's not punitive. It's a natural law that runs the universe. It's a natural law within which the universe runs, put it like that. The law of botany is just simply the law that some clever people have articulated, haven't they, by observing growing things. Well, clever Buddha, and the Indians before him have observed the minds and the lives of sentient beings and have articulated this particular law. That is the law that runs the universe. And this law isn't in terms of making computers or gardens. It's the law that we use to get rid of suffering and get happiness, speaking simply. So there are two main causes of that moment of my suffering. One is my own past action that set me up to have this suffering in relation to Fred. That's the first one, karma, action. Second, the delusion that impelled that action. Because a delusion, a negative action for the Buddha, the heaviest level of negative actions are those that harm others. And so they're driven by one of the poisons, aren't they? I mean, you don't punch a person in the nose because you love them, unless you're doing karate, It comes from anger. You don't steal something because you want to be kind to somebody, It's coming from attachment. So a negative action that harms another is driven by a delusion. So this moment of my suffering is literally, my mind has got billions of karmic seeds in it, because everything we think and do and say drops a seed into my mind. And every moment I experience something is the fruit of one of those seeds. So a moment of suffering is the fruit of a negative action, necessarily. It's the fruit of a seed I planted. If I hadn't planted a negative seed, I wouldn't experience the fruit. Not possible. So everything we experience is the fruit of past actions. So that moment of suffering, one, the cause of it was my past action, and two, the delusion that impelled me to do it. So two main causes of suffering: karma, delusions. So karma, actually, in the terms of the lam rim, karma we learn about in the first scope in junior school. Here we're talking the middle scope, which is high school. I like to call it high school. That's what we're discussing, the mind. So then that means, so in the first level of practice, we have to control the body and speech. They're the servants of the mind, and they're the ones that do the actions of harming others. So we have to learn to control those first. And now we get to the middle scope, or high school, as I call it. We now start to get into the root of the problem, which is the delusions that drive our actions, that drive our body and speech to do things that harm others, and therefore harm ourselves. So the three poisons then: attachment, and then there's aversion. Attachment and anger, these are the two main ones as a result of the root one. Then all the others branches from those. And these two are primordially deep. Attachment, I mean, like I said about Lama Yeshe, could take a whole year to tell us about it, but we never begin to understand it. And the way I talk about it is it's multifaceted, you know. Attachment, it's the main voice of ego grasping. It's primordially deep. We come into this life already programmed with it from having practiced attachment in the past, and this brings the deepest consequence of it, which is dissatisfaction. That's not evident to us. It's not evident to us initially until we look into it deeply, which we'll do, that why dissatisfaction is a product of attachment. We'll go into this. So the deepest level of it, of this consequences of attachment, the suffering of attachment, as Lama Zopa says, the main suffering in the modern world is this primordial feeling of I am not enough. I don't have enough. What I get is not enough. How much food I get, not enough. How much happiness I get, not enough. How much money, how much my boyfriend tells me he loves me. It is never enough. It's our default assumption, deep in the bones of our being. This is the most aching experience of attachment and the consequence of past attachment: dissatisfaction. And it's to the degree of such severity in our culture that we call it self-loathing. I am nobody. I am nothing. It's the commonest suffering, you know, it's most unbearable. So dissatisfaction is the deepest, most primordial level of attachment. Then, of course, naturally, if you are dissatisfied with this moment, what you've got, what you're seeing, what you're tasting, then of course the next level of attachment is this terrible kind of hankering, this craving, this hunger, emotional hunger for something out there, such that when I get it and get it, it will make the pain go away. We get this. We live with this, you know. So there's the dissatisfaction, which gives rise to this hankering, this craving, and then the next function of it, which is a really cruel one, it exaggerates the deliciousness of the cake, Fred, whatever it might be. All this is utterly automatic, all programmed because of habit from countless lifetimes. And this is what being in samsara means, is this, caught up in these delusions, you know. So then when it's in case of in let's say the object is Fred, then the attachment exaggerates the deliciousness of Fred and exaggerates the Fred's role in making me happy. And then, of course, attachment's got the function of being totally obsessive. You think about the object all the time. This we know. Obsessing about it, hungering for it, constantly thinking about it, unable to think of anything else. That's the obvious sign of attachment. And then, of course, when it comes to people and things, the next function of attachment is the possessiveness. It's mine, you know. We recognize every one of these. We recognize all of these different, these are all the aspects of attachment. And basically, it's there all the time. It's like at the level of an assumption. Really, to put it this way, I would say it's like the level of an assumption. And to be very brutal about it, the assumption is that I'm not enough. Therefore, I always have to have something. And it's this constant assumption that I must get only the nice things. Attachment is this junkie in us. We use the word addiction, you know. We use the word like addiction. The Buddha's not joking. I will say it this way, and it's not joking, that attachment is addiction. It's just a question of degree and a question of the object, that's all. Most for us, ordinary attachment is just normal. For the Buddha, it's all mental illness. You know, there's no question. It's terrible, incredible suffering. So this attachment is this assumption that I must get only the nice things every microsecond. In other words, attachment can only bear the nice things. It can't stand a problem. It's like a complete junkie. So then this gives rise. This is the third one. The millisecond attachment doesn't get what it wants. The millisecond attachment is thwarted. That's the arising of the third poison. Aversion is the bare bones state of mind. So that's multifaceted as well. The volatile level of aversion is what we all know as anger. A person shouts and yells and screams, That's obvious. But there are milder levels of aversion, which we don't even consider a problem. Annoyed, irritated, upset, frustrated. They're all polite words for mild anger. And they are all the response when attachment didn't get what it wanted. And because everything that goes on in our mind stays there, it builds up. It doesn't go in one ear and out the other. We all know, and we all know that at the end of the day, there's the straw that breaks the camel's back, and you want to kill your husband. 47 things happen in the daytime. We all know that. That's small moments of aversion, small moments of thwarted attachment. But we don't pay attention to those. We only go to the therapist when you want to kill yourself or your husband. You don't go to your husband. You don't go to the therapist when you get annoyed. But this is our tragedy. We can spend the rest 4 weeks talking about this. This is our tragedy in our culture, that we don't pay attention to what is going on in our mind until it's screaming, until we want to kill somebody or ourselves. But it's just too late half the time, It's unbearable because we don't pay attention. That's our tragedy. We don't pay attention. So attachment and aversion are effectively the two main delusions in our day-to-day life. And then all the other delusions, like arrogance, pride, low self-esteem, they're all branches of these two. I mean, that's what's fascinating. There's a really intimate relationship between all these states of mind. I mean, we'd never have thought in ordinary language attachment and anger are utterly, intimately, inextricably linked. If you did not have attachment, you couldn't possibly ever have a fraction of a moment of aversion or anger. Not a possibility. Or depression. Because, okay, anger is a volatile level. The milder levels of aversion, thwarted attachment, irritation, annoyed, frustrated, upset, and then all the way down internally to despair and depression. They're all aspects of aversion, and aversion is the response when attachment doesn't get what it wants. And attachment runs the show in daily life, basically. So, I mean, these are easy words to say, but to see this, how pervasive these states of mind are, And of course, in the teachings in the Lamb Room, they state very simply, the very first level is you try and control your body and speech. You try not to shout. You try not to kill. You try not to rape. The next level, you try not to, you try to work on the mind. But then we just have to keep seeing the mind ever more deeply, ever more deeply, ever more deeply, to levels of subtlety that we do not posit as possible in our culture, This is being a Buddhist. Doing this job, identifying the mind, what delusion it is, what virtue it is, knowing how to work with the delusion to lessen it, knowing how to grow with the virtue and grow it. That's being a Buddhist. That's the essence of being a Buddhist. There's that lovely story of a teacher or somebody, I think, when some fellow came up and said, I've just done my circumambulations. And the teacher said, I'm very happy about that, but I hope you practice Dharma. Oh, all right then. So he did his meditation. I hope you practice Dharma, like that. Well, I did my mantras, blah, blah, blah. So in other words, you can do your mantras. You can do your prostrations. You can, look like a nice 14th century, like I look, Tibetan monk or nun. But that's not being a Buddhist intrinsically. You're Buddhist when you work on your mind. And that's the interesting point. All the other practices are to support you to do the job of work. Why do you do prostrations? Yeah, I mean, when Lama Yeshe first gave it to me, when I first met him, and he saw my pride and he gave me the practice, he said, good physical yoga, dear, he said, So that's true. Definitely is good physical yoga. But it's a practice to help your mind loosen. You do prostrations, you do water bowls, you become a nun, you wear you live in vows. All of these are techniques that prime our mind so we can do the actual job of lessening delusions and growing the virtues. So because that's where you eventually become a Buddha. So when you think of it this way, it's quite straightforward, but we do get very confused, So attachment is this bottomless pit of neediness, this bottomless pit. It's a symptom. Attachment is a symptom. Actually, this is the thing when we really see it. Attachment based upon dissatisfaction, you analyze, why would you be dissatisfied? It means you're not enough. So attachment is a symptom of a person who thinks they're not enough or don't have enough. We all know this one. And never have enough. I mean, this to analyze attachment in more depth, it's kind of painful to see it, you know. I mean, Lama Zopa said, we've got, okay, in this level, in terms of the Lam Rim, first level of practice, you abide by the laws of karma, you learn to understand karma, you do your purification, you live in vows, essentially you're controlling your behavior. There's no real discussion looking at your mind yet in the first stages of practice. But then that prepares you for the next level, which is where we are now, which is now working on the root of the problem, which is the delusions that inform your body and speech. So this is necessarily more advanced, you know. But as Lama Zopa says, and so the practice of these two is the practice of renunciation. This is the realization we'd get. You're renouncing suffering and its causes. So Rinpoche said, you know, you've got renunciation when just the thought of another moment of attachment, just the thought of another moment of attachment is so repulsive, it's like being in a septic tank. Another time he said it's like using used toilet paper. He's very graphic. So, I mean, way to go. Our default mode is attachment. Until you're really quite advanced, until you're really advanced, attachment is just naturally there. So we shouldn't be disappointed, you know, think, oh, I'm so hopeless, I've got attachment. Yeah, join the universe, folks. So basically, okay, now let's look a little bit now technically at how something so pervasive, so emotional, as we talk about it, as attachment and aversion. We know what anger feels like. We know what, you know, depression and despair feel like. Now let's look technically and see how, in fact, these states of mind are conceptual. It's the biggest surprise to us, you know. So like I said before, in the epistemological model of the mind, we learn that we in the mental consciousness at least, which is, you know, we have only two ways of knowing. There's conceptual and then there's perception. And perception, or direct non-conceptual cognition, as they call it, is only when you've got single point of concentration and you're quite advanced. That's when you've got some realizations. So we live at the conceptual level. But this is the most shocking view for us, because we think conceptual's up here. That's when you're studying math. That's conceptual. You know, theories about cakes, that's conceptual. We think of conceptual as rather rational, you know. But then we go emotion and we point here. But all of this for the Buddha, it's all conceptual. So indeed, Buddha's telling us there are some states of mind that are misconceptions, and they're the delusions. There are some that are particularly emotional, that's like attachment and anger, but there are other misconceptions as well, like no cause and effect, like no emptiness, like believing in a creator. They're misconceptions too. He's not being rude, but they mightn't have emotion around them. So the emotional afflictions are the ones we understand, like attachment, anger, jealousy. And why are they emotional? Because they're so deeply, primordially habitual. That's why. In other words, and this is our biggest problem in our culture, we don't notice what's going on in our mind, our thoughts. There are thousands of thoughts in there. We know. I think even in modern psychology, they say there's like 1,000 thoughts a second. Buddha totally agrees. But we don't notice those thoughts, do we? Until they are screaming out of the mouth, until you want to kill yourself or somebody else, or you're lying in bed depressed and inert because you can't move. That's when we only notice it. In other words, we give such power to our bodies that we only notice our thoughts when the body feels them. And that's too late. I use the analogy, and it's kind of dumb, but it's pretty powerful. It's like you've got a car and you've never heard of the concept of mechanics. So you drive and you drive and you drive your car, and then one day at 100 miles an hour, on the freeway, you notice your wheels are falling off. And it's the first time you've noticed. That's our problem with emotions. This is our tragedy, because we don't pay attention to the baby events. We don't notice the wheels wobbling. We don't notice that annoyance and the irritation and the frustration and the bit of hurt. We just don't notice it. Or we continually blame the outside, so we don't pay attention to it until one day it is so severe, and then it's too late. You can't do much. Damage control is the best. And that's why we have such terrible mental suffering in our culture. I'm not trying to make it simplistic, because we don't pay attention. We don't have methods. And we blame the outside. We blame the outside for the happiness as well. And because of that, we're paying attention to the outside. We don't pay attention to the inside until it's screaming. Then we have no choice. Then we don't know what to do with it because we've gone berserk, you know. So this is where, at least if a minimal application of Buddha's techniques of watching your breath every day, a little bit of watching your breath and a few practices, a minimal application at least gives you some tools to start to actually notice what the name of heaven is going on inside your thoughts. And then you can start in the daily life, start to catch your thoughts, you know. That's the job of being a Buddhist. And then what do you do with them? You reconfigure them because they're concepts. They're not set in stone. But our tragedy is because we notice our thoughts only when it's too late and they become full-fledged emotion and your body's shaking, then we see them as absolute truth. This is the other tragedy. You know, and we believe utterly, we see as absolute, that thought about what Fred did and Fred is evil, or that thought about yourself, I am no good. We believe that with absolute certainty. 27 people we know can tell us we're not as bad as we think. We do not believe them. This is the worst tragedy of all. And this is because of habit, nothing more, nothing more. It's habit. So these emotions, these, you know, emotions, what we mean by an emotion is when the body's involved. Think about it. When the body's involved, that's what we call it emotion. People even talk about feeling it in their body. And that's okay. And there's some of Lord Buddha's techniques. I mean, his very first meditation, one of Buddha's first Vipassana meditations, insight meditations, is to use your concentration in the first mode of meditation to observe the sensations in your body. And what does he want us to get insight into? Not the body, for goodness sake. It's because we are so embodied. He uses the body so we can get insight into impermanence. Some people, we do not know what's going on in our mind until our body feels it. This is our tragedy. And then we mystify it. Oh, I feel it in my body. That's just your body. It's not your mind at all. It's your body. We've got to be able to see our mind. At least and that means to hear the conceptual story that is there. That's what we have to learn to understand, how these deluded conceptual stories, these delusions, these emotions are exaggerations. That the key function of all the delusions, this is the way the mind functions, the key function of all the afflictions, as they call them in Buddhism, you know, these mental illnesses, these afflictions, these delusions, these disturbing emotions, their main function is that they exaggerate. So when you can articulate as a thought that anger that you're experiencing, so you will hear it if you wrote it down. You know, you're mad at Fred and I will tell you about my anger and I'm crying. How dare he do that to me? I do not deserve it. He is so bad. I cannot stand Fred. He did this and he did that. He did do that action, but anger embellishes it. There is a chocolate cake on that plate, but attachment embellishes it. This is the part that we have to learn to see. That all the afflictions, that, as they call them, these emotional afflictions, these disturbing emotions, they are liars. They are misconceptions. And when we can start to listen to the conception in the mind and unpack it and argue with it, that's when we're really on track. That's how you change your mind. If we believe we change our anger and we just think anger is an emotion and anger is physical, well, it's not possible to change it. I agree with you. It's just too mystical. But when you know that what's informing that emotion, that shaking, what's informing that physical feeling is that conceptual story that we're so practiced in thinking, which is the angry thoughts, you know. It's very hard to see this, but it's a revelation when we can. Are there any questions? More questions? Any questions? 8:30. It's time to finish. Oh my God, look at this. Any questions?
There was one comment in the chat. It
Good.
said, it was from Joanna. It says, I'd like to understand more about the concept of we create karma by experiencing. I will presumably do something if I understand even this part correctly.
Absolutely, Joanna. It's now, today's over, I think. It's 90 minutes or 2 hours today, Christian.
90 minutes.
Okay, let's finish. We're finished. But we'll do that. We'll go into more details, Joanna, next week. I'm going to go back and forth between the mind and karma because they're so utterly linked, you know. I'll go into karma and how it works. We'll do that, absolutely. So at the moment, I'm just trying to focus on these thoughts, attachment and anger, trying to get to see how, just talking about them. So any other questions there, Christian?
That was the only one, unless someone has another one.
Yeah. Anybody, any question of any kind? Please, people, if you have.
Hi, this is Joanna, and
yes, Joanna.
I don't know if you can see a comment in my chat. I wrote another one.
Oh, you did? Another one. What was that?
Let me see. Yeah, I'm going to read this. Just
read that, darling. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So this is what came to my mind, and I wanted to ask about it. But isn't repulsion to attachment, as you quoted, just like the repulsion to using used toilet paper, an afflictive emotion in itself, just like running away from what we don't like is?
It could easily be. It could be that. It could be that, but that's not obviously the meaning, is it? I mean, it's like we have to learn to see that there is a way of having what sounds like aversion, but to treat it like a virtue, it's like a way of helping us know ourselves and know our mind. I mean, I think in ordinary terms, you know, if you're an ordinary person, there's going to be some affliction there, but in the end, I think it has to be, we have to see the advantage of seeing the disadvantage of delusions and how they cause us pain.
So maybe understanding the virtue of that aspect rather than something just that we don't like.
I think so, because I mean the fact is, if we could see the suffering of attachment, and that means, as Rinpoche put it, you know, it would be like using used toilet paper, is just being very graphic, then I think you're a pretty advanced person. I think that would not be regular aversion at all, and no way in the universe, because aversion in its nature is when attachment doesn't get what it wants. That's the aversion that's utterly linked to and intimately connected to attachment. It's the regular aversion is the response when attachment doesn't get what it wants. So that's clearly not what Lama Zopa is describing.
Yes, as you said, it may get quite tricky because it's basically just even understanding what is virtuous aversion, what is the real essence of it. Oh dear.
exactly, Joanna, and that's a good point. Thank you. So next week we'll talk more about karma too, and so I'll try just to give some more details. But I think the key one I'm trying to see here is trying to get us to begin to understand is how the body dominates us, and therefore and because of that, and because we're so addicted to the outside world and the outside events, and we're so addicted to their being the cause of our happiness and suffering. So all our attention, is paid onto the outside world. So we only notice what's happening in here when it's so loud we can't avoid it, and that's the wheels falling off, and that's just a little bit too late, you know. And we've got these marvelous skills with the Buddha to learn to start to notice what's happening before the wheels fall off. We need to learn to observe. We need to see when the wheels are wobbling, because we can do something about it then. That's the miracle, you know. Think of it that way. It's just so practical. And I think that's what generally the world, with all the different variations of mindfulness that people are talking about in psychology now, that people are seeing, you know, we can start to become a bit conscious, which is marvelous, which is the point, which is Buddha's skill, you know. Don't wait till it's too late. So, okay. Gone like a dream, our 90 minutes, Christian. So should we just do that? Have you got the little prayers there? What do you do at the end? Just put the two little prayers up. We'll finish the little dedication. Yeah. It's like, I think of the motivation and dedication are like two bookends that hold up the action of the teaching, you know. So we did our motivation. We thought we're going to listen to these teachings so that we can develop our marvelous potential so we can become a Buddha. That was our motivation. So now we're saying all these seeds we've planted from listening to these teachings, may we nourish them so that we do become a Buddha, so that we really can be a benefit to others. So it's like the other end, you know. Oh, what's this one? Oh, very nice. Okay, this is a nice one. So may whatever virtue I've collected benefit the teachings and all transmigratory beings, and in particular, may it cause the essence of perfect, pure Losang Drapa's teachings to shine forever. We've got the bodhicitta prayer there, Christian. Further down, maybe. Is it? No, this is a different, I think another page. This is no good. This is a long thing. Never mind. Cancel. Don't worry about it. Next week, let's have the two dedication prayers that we always classically do. One is just called, it begins with Gewa D, and the second one is the Jungchub Semchog, may bodhicitta grow and grow. Get those two. So the second one, I'll just sing it in Tibetan, may bodhicitta, this amazing aspiration to be a benefit to others, may it grow and grow in the hearts of all. Jangchob Semchog Rinpoche, Ma Kye Panam Ke Gyuchig, Kye Panyampa Me Payang, Gong Ne Gong Du Pava Sho. Okie doke. Thanks, Christian. Thank you, everybody, so much.
Thank you, Ven Robina.
See you in a few days. Before you know it, we'll be back together. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much, Robina.
Bye, darlings.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. Have a good night.
Thanks, Christian.
Thank you, Christian.